Equality Now is a feminist organization using the law to protect and promote the human rights of all women and girls. Now, they create, they reform, and they challenge and apply the law, establishing enduring equality everywhere. Their global network of lawyers, activists, and supporters hold governments responsible for their international obligation to prohibit all forms of violence and discrimination against women. We're pleased to be having with us as a guest now the legal advisor at Equality Now, Jorie Dugan. And we thank you so much for being with us, Jorie.
Thank you for having me.
And when we talk a little bit about Equality Now, I know the work is really just that, bring about equality. And I want to talk because this month is a very special month. It is a Sexual Assault Awareness Month. But from your perspective, talk to us about sexual assault and where we see it today.
Sure, that's a great question. And yes, we are, April is Sexual Assault Month, and sexual assault is a form of sexual violence. And at Equality Now, one of our major pieces of work and area that we work in is to end sexual violence. And, you know, one of the major data points is that globally, the data shows that 1 in 3 women will experience physical or sexual violence in their lifetime, regardless of age, regardless of background, or regardless of country. So talking about sexual violence and being aware of the particular places we are in the world today when it comes to the laws around sexual violence and the barriers to justice around sexual violence is really critical because it remains a major problem all throughout the world.
When we talk about it going on throughout the world, many times there are a blind eye to this, simply because many people just do that. They turn a blind eye. They're not paying attention to what's going on. But when we look at sexual violence, you've got boots on the ground. Talk to us about what we're seeing and what we're seeing an increased rise of.
Great question. So Equality Now, we have boots on the ground in every hemisphere of the world. We work with global partners who work on the ground. We know that they are the best suited to see the changes that need to be made and how the changes should be made. And one of the big parts of our work is we take what we're hearing from the ground and look at the laws in specific regions and identify what changes need to be made and how the changes need to be made. And as you said, we are identifying particular changes that need to be made globally and regionally. And Equality Now recently published a report looking specifically at the Americas region, and we reviewed laws in 43 jurisdictions and in 35 countries in North America, Central America, South America, and the Caribbean. And we were able to identify particular barriers that were common throughout that region, but we also know that these are barriers to survivors of sexual violence all over the world. So the top 3 barriers to justice that we're seeing through our work includes the rape definitions in countries themselves, statute of limitations, and the way the law treats adolescent girls. So if you permit me, I would love to kind of briefly touch on each 3 of these main barriers.
Absolutely. I want to talk about rape because I think that's something that that definition has seen a lot of movement. And we know that you've done some work internationally. Talk to us, because how rape is viewed in America is not how rape is viewed in other countries.
It's very true. So, you know, one of the things that we've noticed in the US and all of the Americas region and really all over the world, there are so many rape laws that are still rooted in the idea that rape is an act of violence that involves physical force. So we see countries around the world having definitions of rape that are based on force or the threat of force, as opposed to the lack of consent. And we know that a narrow definition of rape, for example, sexual intercourse committed by force, is just a very narrow view, and in fact leaves many sexual acts unpunished, and it leaves, unfortunately, many victims unprotected simply because of the reality and diversity of what sexual violence can actually look like. So our recommendation around rape definitions is to be aligned with international law. And international law prescribes that legal definitions of rape and sexual assault should be centered around individuals' consent to participate in the sexual act. So a sexual act committed without a person's consent. And, you know, human rights law in particular also conceives of the fact that when you assess consent, it must be assessed in the context of surrounding circumstances, because it's critical to realize that often consent cannot necessarily be given voluntarily, genuinely, or willingly in coercive circumstances, such as the exploitation of power dynamics or positions of authority or vulnerability and trust and dependence. So we're seeing a big barrier when it comes to how rape definitions in the US and around the world are actually formulated. So the actual text of the law poses a barrier to survivors.
Yeah. And when we talk about this in the issue of rape and sexual violence, we know that we're still at the end, where hopefully we're coming out of the end of the worst of COVID. And talking to people, they said throughout COVID, because people are connected, whether it's domestically or internationally, and a lot of people have been forced to stay home, we've seen increased amounts of cases of that. Is that true?
Exactly right. Yeah. So, COVID, and we're still in the pandemic. So it's really had, we would say it's highlighted a lot of the discriminatory problems that already existed for women and girls when it comes to violence against women, and really just exacerbated those many complex factors. And as you said, it rendered many women and girls all over the world more vulnerable to incidences of sexual violence, domestic violence, sexual exploitation. We saw, more girls being, vulnerable to child marriage even. And it does in part go down to, for example, the lockdowns that we had. It cut survivors and people off from accessing supportive services that they may need, even for preventive measures. And in many cases, lockdowns also increase the risk of domestic violence and sexual violence in the home or wherever you were locked down. And service providers themselves found it difficult, right, to continue to work and provide support to the communities. And unfortunately, on the governmental level, where we really try to push to hold government to account to their responsibilities, we unfortunately saw and continue to see a deprioritization of sexual violence cases, whether it's through what the government chooses to fund in terms of supportive and preventive measures, but also the cases that they pursue in terms of justice measures.
We talked about three areas. We talked about rape being one of them. Go ahead into your second area.
Sure. So another barrier is statute of limitations. So a statute of limitations is a law that sets the amount of time, it's normally in years, that a victim has to come forward to report a crime for, prosecution or a civil matter, if that's what they choose. And we see that short statutes of limitations actually place an overwhelming burden on victims because, as we know, trauma takes time. And whether it's because of trauma or stigma, sometimes a continued threat of violence or lack of community support, or sometimes when violence may have happened to someone as a minor, it can take additional time to process what has happened. So there are many factors that prevent victims from reporting a crime or delay reporting. So human rights activists and legal experts in international law really recommend that when it comes to statute of limitations, there should be no limitation when it comes to sexual violence crime, both for adults and child victims, simply because of the impact and the nature of the crime and the delays it takes sometimes to report them. The other barrier that we see, which I think is, maybe lesser known, is the way the law actually treats adolescent girls when it comes to sexual violence. So through our analysis of laws in the Americas, there's this crime called estupro in Latin America, but there are estupro-like crimes throughout the region. And estupro crimes describe situations in which adults have sexual relations with minors who are above the legal age of consent. So we're not talking about statutory rape, but we're talking about sexual violence of 14, 15, 16-year-olds. And these discriminatory laws often result from adults who have sexual intercourse with 14, 15, 16-year-olds as after means of seduction, deceit, often promises of marriage or promises of other things, which under an international model rape law would be defined as rape. And the problem here and the barrier to justice is often in the Americas, we see this being used to either mislabel rape cases, circumvent charges of rape, and really ignoring the exploitation of unequal power dynamics when it comes to adolescent girls, who can often be vulnerable for many reasons. And the problem really comes down to when it comes to holding perpetrators accountable or really seeking justice for survivors who are of that age. Because we see that it creates a hierarchy of sexual violence, and it also creates a standard of which victims we think are more deserving of justice, and really devaluing the lives of adolescent girls. So, for example, in Cuba, if an adolescent girl is raped, and the charge is a stupro, the penalty there is as low as 3 months. Whereas if it was to be what we would say the charge of rape, which it should fall under, the penalty is 4 to 10 years. So you have a matter of months versus a matter of years, and it just is embedded in the law that kind of adolescent is devalued by their governments. So this is an alarming barrier to justice that, in the sexual violence discourse is not talked about as much.
When we talk about the statute of limitations, Joy, I want to look a little bit deeper into this because you're right. We see somebody who's engaged, who's been violated. Sometimes it does take a minute for a person to really get themselves mentally, emotionally ready to come forward and be able to bring those proceedings. As you talk about the battle, what kind of pushback are you receiving when it comes to statute of limitations?
Great question. So, a lot of the time it comes down to, lawmakers and governments saying you can't leave a crime open for um, indefinite period of time because due process, and the due process rights regarding this issue. And we definitely are the mindset that everyone deserves to have their rights upheld, human rights, due process rights, and all of that. But I think when it comes to sexual violence crimes, there's a lot of misconception around it, right? There's still this a lot of stereotypes that if it really was sexual violence and you really were traumatized by it, then why wouldn't you come forward, right? There is this misunderstanding of trauma and the impact it has, and also kind of the societal stigma that keeps a lot of survivors hesitant to come forward. And the law is not equipped to handle that reality. And I think a lot of pushback we get are from people who aren't educated on the fact that sexual violence trauma takes time, and there are a multitude of reasons why a victim may delay reporting. And it's not because what the law might say that it wasn't serious enough for them.
If you talk to us a little bit about communities that are actually affected by this, we see that many times the people that you are representing actually come from marginalized communities. Can you give me a little bit more about the demographics that you're seeing when you are representing these cases? Because many times the people who you're talking about come from these areas.
Sure. So we know globally, marginalized communities are more likely actually to be subject to sexual violence, and not only subject to sexual violence, but they also are more likely to have negative interactions with law enforcement, and with the justice systems that they come in contact with. And we know this is happening around the world, not just in the United States, though we know it happens at alarming rates in the United States, especially when it comes to people who, whether it's race or economic issues, they fall at intersections where the rates of injustice and the way that their cases are handled are alarming and concerning. But this also happens all over the world, like you said. So we've seen, indigenous women, for example, in all of North America, they're less likely to have their sexual violence cases even investigated by police. We are seeing women with disabilities who live in Eurasia. They often have their cases completely discounted because their particular accessibility needs aren't being met to continue a case. And in India, we work with a lot of women groups and survivors on the ground there who come from minority communities who face discrimination, based on both their caste and their tribal ethnic identities. And yet we see that this group of women, or these groups of women, they face the highest rate of sexual violence in the country. So one of the, really important things that we embed in our recommendations is that any solutions really need to be intersectional, because right now, we know the legal systems, they don't work equally for everyone, and they really need to, no matter your race, your ethnicity, your religion, where you're living, your disability, national or immigration status, caste, sexual orientation. I could go on. It needs to work for everybody, and we're seeing that it doesn't.
Yeah. I know that the work that you do is individual, but it's also collective. And you guys have been working together with many groups, collaborating really to bring awareness to this and then also to advocate on behalf of these victims. Can you give me a little bit of perspective on the collaboration, how you've been able to get your message out to other groups, organizations to bring this awareness so that way we can see some sort of action taken?
Yeah, that's a great question because it's a really big hallmark of how equality now works. So we like to say we work in interrelated pathways, and I talked a bit about how we work on the legal side and identifying the gaps and changes that need to be made. But a big part of how we work is with our global partners. We know we don't do anything without global partners and people on the ground actually saying, this is what we see, this is the change we need, and this is how we see it happening. And one of the things that we do is we really invest in our partnerships. Partnerships are mutual. We work both ways, and we are led by our partnerships on the ground. And what we do is we often bring groups together. So partners in one region, we bring in connection with another group, either in the region or globally, to really amplify international advocacy. And what we end up doing is when we work in partnerships in this way is we're able to harness the diversity of people working together around the world around a given legal issue or many legal issues. And we're able to capitalize or harness, the power of social media, mainstream outlets. We like to work with, influencers, activists, and artists on the ground, really to engage in many different ways with the public, with media, with governments to raise awareness, change attitudes, which is a big part, and really why we want to work with a diverse group of partners around the world to change attitudes and ultimately, gain support for the legislative and systemic change we want to make. So that's we really encourage a diverse group of partnerships to work for, and we love to bring groups together to amplify collective messaging.
Give me a little bit about receptivity, right? Because as you're going about and you're making your case known for, you're being a voice for the voiceless. And as you're a voice for the voiceless, you're introducing some of the things that maybe many people are not so familiar with. As you're going about meeting groups, organizations, what is their reaction when you start to unpack a lot of the trauma and a lot of the barriers that these victims are actually facing?
Well, I think one of the benefits of what the lens we're able to bring to the table is when we get in touch with groups on the ground who are working in this area, and we know we're definitely not the first ones to or the leaders in this space. There have been people, activists on the ground who have been working tireless at this for decades, and when we like to come in, we like to amplify what the messaging that they are taking forward. And the lens that we add to this discourse is really the backing of an international human rights framework. A lot of the times when we work with groups, they're working with sexual violence on the ground, trying to change local laws or bring awareness to other barriers on the ground. And they might not be aware that there's a lot of backing from the international community. Governments can be actually held accountable because of their obligations under international human rights law and in other international jurisprudence. And what we have seen is the ability to just amplify a message by bringing marrying the local advocacy with the international force that international law has, and being able to and in many cases it's I don't want to say validating, but in some cases, groups where they are able to amplify their message by using, this is not only a violation we're seeing individually and locally, but it's an obligation my government owes me because of international law. And we're able to bring that in and really add that added element to the messaging. And it does really, solidify that what they're seeing on the ground is a human rights violation. It's not just an individual violation that they feel, it's a human rights violation, and they have every right to hold their governments accountable for it.
So, how does the public get involved to work and partner with the work that you're doing?
So, we encourage anyone to get involved with us. We always are looking to hear from anyone and everyone around the world to see how we can amplify our mutual messages. The first step I would say is feel free to go to our website. It's www.equalitynow.org. There's a tab that it's called Get Involved. So if you hit that tab, there's many ways to learn more. You can join our newsletter. You can follow us on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn. We're on all of those social media platforms, and we are eager to, get involved with you and for you to get involved with us and learn more.
And so, as you're looking towards 2022, what are some of the things that maybe we should be keeping our eyes on, paying attention to as the year goes forward?
So Equality Now, we're going to continue our work. Our Ending Sexual Violence campaign is ever going. So we're going to be continuing to, look at laws, make recommendations. Again, if there's people who are listening today that would like to lend their voice to our advocacy, we'd love to get connected. We're going to be also looking more at intersectional issues, for example, with survivors with disabilities. We're expanding our work a lot in the Middle East and North Africa region, actually. So we're working with a lot of women's groups there. And we're also turning our attention to focusing on online sexual exploitation and abuse and formulating recommendations for governments on how to protect human rights in the digital space, which was ever evolving.
Yeah. Before we leave, I do want to get an opportunity for you to just share very quickly about that digital space, because there was something we left out. But give us what we're seeing in the digital space, because we know a lot is going on by way of trafficking, a lot is going on by way of communication. Talk to us about that.
Sure. Yeah. So I would definitely keep an eye out for that coming out from Equality Now in the future, because we are doing more work on that, because, online sexual exploitation, sexual violence and trafficking, we are seeing the technology space and the digital world really posing new, complex, and ever evolving challenges. And as generations spend more and more time on the internet and have increased access to the digital world, which is a good thing, but it does come with a lot of risks of exploitation. And we're seeing that. We're seeing various forms of, either whether it's grooming or facilitating exploitation and trafficking. And while the digital realm has exploded and taken is going to new heights all the time, the protections have not. So we really need to catch up and make sure that the same human rights that are protected outside the digital world are also protected online. And we need, governments to get involved with this too, to make sure that those who are, responsible for these online platforms are equally responsible or take responsibility in making sure that it's a safe space, especially for women and girls who are vulnerable to exploitation and sexual violence through the online media.
Yeah. Jorie, we're going to leave it there, but I want to thank you so much for joining us and being with us here on the Social Justice Forums. A lot of information to unpack, and certainly a lot of information to follow. Hopefully we'll be able to get you back, give us an update as to how things are going and what progress is actually being made. But thank you for shedding light on a very important topic as we talk about Sexual Assault Awareness Month. That's this month, and you've brought to light a lot of helpful information. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much for having me, Daren. Thank you for the work that you do.
Thank you. Jorie Dugan, our guest here on the Social Justice Forums. We want you to take a quick break. And when we come back, stay with us. We're coming right back with another guest. We'll be right back in a few.